If I had to pick the #1 garden hack that led to me growing an $85,000 garden on 1/3 of an acre, it would be the planting strategy I'm about to share with you. I'm Zach Buckle. I'm a veggie farmer in Cody, Wyoming. And by the end of this video, I'm going to show you my painless way to plan succession planting for the entire season. Growing 30 different vegetables at one time can be insanely overwhelming, whether you're a gardener or a farmer. So in order to make that a lot less stressful, I use a tool like the planting schedule you're going to see behind me that outlines when the best time to seed or sow all of the crops that I like to grow. And you'll notice on that planting schedule, it is all scheduled according to your average last frost and first frost, 2 different dates. And you'll notice about half of the crops say plant before your average first frost. That gives you an entire planting window for the season to plant that same crop. So you can still plant it in June, July, August a lot of times, depending on the crop. And it basically makes it so you automatically have fall planting and gardening factored into your schedule by just checking this simple schedule every single week of the year of the growing season. If you're interested in getting this sent to you, click the link below and I'll send it to your email. So the way I begin succession planting for the season is I basically plant enough plants to fill out my entire spring garden footprint. And that process starts in February or March for me, when I start to sow crops like celery, onions, tomatoes, and crops that take a really long time to grow in pots like these. Then every week, I just make it a weekly task to check that planting schedule that we talked about earlier and see which plants on that schedule are ready to sow. And I will keep doing that every week until I fill out my nursery space, which you can use something like this grow light setup to do that at home. That makes it really simple, so I don't have to think too hard about, do I need the exact amount of plants for this amount of yield, blah, blah, blah. It's really simple to just start by filling out your nursery space, because you could still sow a lot of these crops directly by hand in the spring. And you don't want all of these crops to be ready at once anyway. You want a nice staggered flow throughout the growing season. So start by just filling out your entire nursery. So if you're doing that in a grow light setup, you would just keep planting until you'd fill out all 3 shelves you see here with plant flats, and then you're basically done. And until you start to bring those plants outside and put them in the ground, and then you can resow more. But this is basically how much inventory you could have in plants at one time. And you could fit a ton of garden crops in here. You could fit plenty of tomatoes, cucumbers, celery, all that stuff you want for an average family-sized garden in a grow light setup just like this. Then, once my average last frost comes around, which for me is around May 21st, I start to harden off all of those nursery plants that we started back in February or March by slowly acclimating them to sunlight, direct sunlight outside. So you start taking the plants outside for a couple hours a day at first, and then slowly do it more throughout a week is usually about the right time period. And I usually like to put them in a spot outside where it'll get shade in the afternoon, and then I don't have to worry about moving them around as much all the time. And then I plant those in the ground on that garden that I have set up, and then I direct seed whatever space I have left with crops like carrots, beets, radishes, all stuff that's going to grow relatively quickly, greens, and then the whole garden is basically planted by first week in June, when in my climate all crops really start to grow well. And that makes it really easy to plant the entire garden. This way I don't need to stress about starting absolutely every crop that I'm going to grow throughout the season in my indoor nursery, because This does require some maintenance. You got to be watering these plants pretty much every day and keeping an eye on them. And to do that for your entire garden adds a lot of stress. And you get almost the same result from direct seeding a lot of crops. So it takes a lot of pressure off my brain to be able to direct seed about half of the crops that I grow on the farm. And a note about the right number of plants for whatever result that you want. Don't stress too much about that at the beginning. If you're not a super experienced gardener, don't stress too much about it. And in general, start more than you think you're going to need. But if you're starting something like kale, I wouldn't start any more kale plants than you could fit in a plant cell tray like this. This cell tray has 8 cells in it. That's more than enough kale plants for a lot of food, or broccoli or cabbage or stuff like that. Just, if you're a beginner, start by just filling out one cell tray with the crop that you want in general. You know, things like tomatoes, you'll need a bigger pot like this. You'll want probably 6 tomato plants, maybe 10. You don't want too many tomato plants because that adds a lot of risk to your yields that you're going to get, because tomatoes are hard to grow. The stuff that you grow in pots like these, like broccoli, kale, cabbage, that kind of stuff is a lot less risky, a lot more likely to put food on your table. But don't stress too much about the number of plants, because you can always sow a lot of these crops again later in June, July for a fall crop. And over time, as you continue to garden every single year, you're going to get better at knowing exactly how many plants you need for the result that you want. But as a beginner, I would recommend just sticking to filling out 1 plant cell, or maybe 2, depending on the crop you want. And don't overthink it too much, because that's where you're going to get overwhelmed in thinking, oh, I need to have 20 plants for 20 heads of broccoli. You know, just work on filling out your nursery space with food and filling out your garden with food. And once you get better at doing that, then getting the exact result you want every time is going to be easier for you, because you'll know and you'll have experience. But get better at just filling out your entire garden with food first before you stress about the exact number of plants you need. Now, once my spring garden is fully planted out and I've got plants growing in the ground and seeds germinating in the ground, my nursery is usually empty, or pretty close to empty. So I continue to check that planting schedule weekly all the way until August and see which crops I can sow inside. And so I just keep filling that nursery up with plants, stuff that I know my family wants to eat or my customers want to eat, and I sow them in the nursery, keep filling it up, and just focus on that and not worrying about the exact number of plants and all that stuff. And then throughout the season, as we harvest crops out of the garden, say this is a harvestable crop like lettuce or something that we planted in spring. As we harvest it in July, now we have an open space to plant something else. So I could plant it with fall beets or something like that. And if you had plants ready to go, those beets are going to be really big by the time the fall comes around. So this is how you can easily succession plant. Whenever you have open space in your garden, you just replant with either plants you have from your nursery or seeds that you know will mature in your climate. All you got to do is check that planting schedule every single week to make sure you have enough time in your season for that crop to mature. And this takes away a lot of the complications you can have from looking at a bunch of different schedules or stressing about, do I have enough time all the time? Because that schedule has all the information you need for the entire season. And now I could just plan the garden as I grow. I don't have to plan it all in January. Every single thing doesn't need to be planned perfectly. On my farm, nothing ever goes according to plan. So I use this strategy like crazy. I know in general which crops are going to sell for me, and I know in general how fast they're going to mature pretty much by heart now. I don't even need a schedule really that much because I've done this so many times, but I just have an arsenal of crops in my brain that if my first crop doesn't work for some reason, I can quickly remove it and replant to something else, or if a crop is mature earlier than I expected, I just harvest it, amend it, replant. It's not a big deal. So I just look at it like an assembly line. I focus on keeping the garden full of food at all times and keeping the nursery full of plants at all times until about August or something like that. That's when you're going to run out of time to use their nursery. But if you focus on just keeping your nursery and your garden full of food at all times, it's going to take away a lot of the stress that you have about succession planting. So when I first started farming, I used to look at like 3 different planting schedules, one for a greenhouse, one for fall, one for spring. And at the end of the year, I still had tons of crops that didn't mature on time because I had all this information all over the place, and it was really hard to stay on top of it all. But once I started to combine those 2 schedules for spring and fall, and I even have a version for greenhouses, into what I like to call planting windows, which means you have from this date till this date to plant that crop and get it to mature in your climate. It really changed the farm. It's what I credit the farm from going to 55,000 in sales to 85,000 in sales on the same land over the past 2 years. It wasn't fancy greenhouse tomatoes or fancy cucumbers, all of the really expensive stuff that you might see market farms grow. What really made this farm profitable was this concept, assembly line of food. All I focused on this past season was keeping the entire farm planted as much as humanly possible. So if we could get 3 crops, we're getting 3 crops. If we could get 4 crops, we're getting 4 crops in one bed. So if you apply this concept to your garden and just get 2 crops, you're going to grow way more food than you ever thought was possible by just thinking of it as an assembly line. So as one crop matures, you're replanting another crop, and it's so much simpler than keeping track of special dates for fall, greenhouse, all these different things. Just keep it all in one spot and think of it as a planting window. You have from this date till this date to sow that seed, and it will mature in your growing season. So here's an example to show you how powerful this idea is when it comes to growing food. Say it's July 15th, but your garden is completely full of food. You don't have any room to plant any more crops directly in the ground, but you still want some fall bok choy. But you notice that you have a bed of carrots that is probably going to be mature by August 1st. What you can do is sow that bok choy in your nursery on July 15th, and it will be good in these plants cells for 4 to 6 weeks, especially if you get one this big. So that bok choy can be growing in your nursery while your carrots are finishing up, and then around August 1st you can harvest those carrots, and 2 weeks later you can plant that bok choy that's half grown. So it's easily going to mature in your growing season. That's the power of having a nursery, because you can have plants that are half grown, and again, all you need to do is worry about keeping this full at all times. You're never going to regret having too many plants. You can always find a spot to plant them, or if not, it's not that big of a deal. It doesn't cost you much money at all to start bok choy plants or kale. A packet of kale seeds costs $2 or $3 for a couple hundred seeds. That's a couple hundred potential kale plants. And the potting soil cost is pennies. I don't even think it is a penny for one bok choy plant, even if you buy the top quality potting soil like I do. It's pocket change in the grand scheme of things. So you're never going to regret having too many plants. You can always start more than you need, and this allows you to grow 2 crops at once and have a half-grown plant in the ground that will easily produce food for you in your season. The difference between a bok choy plant that's half grown in the ground and direct sowing a seed at the same time is about 3 to 4 weeks, which in a very short growing season like mine is very significant. 3 to 4 weeks is pretty likely that the direct seeded bok choy would not mature. So having an indoor nursery of some kind allows you to grow a lot more food in a short growing season. So always want to keep this full of plants. If you are interested in setting up an indoor grow light setup like this, it's really easy and not very expensive. Basically what you have here is a simple shelving unit. You can buy these almost anywhere on the internet. Amazon definitely has them. I have a 4-shelf unit, but I only have lights on 3 shelves. And what these are Barina grow lights, which I will link the link to buy these exact grow lights in the description. And you just zip tie them to the shelving unit. It's really that simple. And these lights are designed to grow plants, so you don't have to worry so much about getting the right lumens. If you're going to use regular LED lights, it's a little more complicated. These are more designed to grow plants, and you don't need as many of them. And you just rig them up to a simple Christmas light timer to get about 12 to 16 hours of light a day. It's really that easy. And then for plant cells, I love using permanent plant trays. These are from Vego Garden. These are injection molded plant trays. They are not going to break on you. These are going to last you a lifetime. And they come with air pruning, which is amazing for making your plants grow faster. What happens is the roots will go in a spiral as they're growing, but when they hit this air slit, they stop growing and spiraling, and makes it so the roots are going to touch the soil immediately as soon as they get in the ground, and they grow a lot faster. I have tried both ways on my farm, and these are by far worth every penny for just the air pruning and making sure that you never have to buy them again. That is a key detail, because these cheap ones that are, I think this was like $2 for all of these will last you 1 season. They get holes in them, and then look how easy it is. There's already a big hole in them and they're broken. So when you have the money to invest, I highly recommend you buy permanent trays like this that will not break. I will leave a link to these exact trays in the description, and there's a discount code there to use as well. But there's a couple different places to sell them. I highly recommend you buy them. They're just by far worth the money, because you never have to buy them again. And setting up a nursery like this, if it costs you $200, which I bet it won't cost you $200, but even if it costs you $200, I guarantee you it will pay for itself in 1 season if you do what I'm talking about and keep your garden full of food and plants. It will pay for itself in 1 season compared to buying those same plants at a local commercial nursery. You're going to save so much money by growing your own plants. For an example, I think one 6-cell tray like this at a nursery is probably going to cost you $3 to $4. If you grew the same amount of food in one of these at home, it's going to cost you pennies, probably like 30 cents. Seriously, that's how much the difference is. So when you add that up over 3 shelves of food, I'm not even considering the amount of food you're going to grow that you wouldn't be able to grow if you didn't have a nursery. But just in saving the money on plants that you buy at a Walmart or a box store or a commercial nursery, it is going to pay for itself in 1 season. So it's a really good investment. Both of these things are a really good thing to spend your money on. So if you're serious about growing food and you would like that planting schedule, click that link in the description below and I'll send it to you. And you'll also get my free Backyard Farm Launchpad, which is a complete no-dig garden setup guide for you to set up a no-dig garden in your backyard, which makes all of the concepts I talked about today so much easier than your traditional tilled garden. So check that out, the link in the description below. And if you take away one thing from this video, just keep your garden full of food May through October. That will dramatically increase your yields probably more than you've ever seen before in your garden. If you do that alone, you're going to be blown away by the results. Keep the garden full of food May through October.